Well, I guess I'm gonna do another one of these low quality videos from my car. Although I am very much parked, not driving, so don't worry. And I'm going to just gripe about something I've already talked about before. I sort of tried to frame more optimistically last time. Which is how, like, at least in some way, I am trans. Although I barely look it right now, don't I? The reason is that I just sort of gave up on transition about 2 years in, and have tried to resume several times, only to be prevented by a multitude of different factors. First time was because I got manic and had a psychotic break, and they didn't want me to resume hormones when I was in a fragile mental state, which was within reason. But then after I stabilized, got the same answer. And then the pandemic happened and became even more difficult. And then now I'm back to living with my parents, which is why I'm recording in my car. It's like, this is gonna be a lot of oh poor me, which I really shouldn't, because I'm very fortunate. I was born a US citizen, white, middle class. I have the luxury that I can live with my parents, you know. They will give me a place to live and food to eat. I'm not out on the street. I'm very grateful for that. But my life is kind of garbage right now. And it's for a lot of reasons, some of which I need to accept responsibility for, if only for the reason, you know, when I accept that I really do have decisions in my control, then I have agency over my own future. But I do have to talk about things that I don't have agency over, and that do affect my future quite deeply. Which is the last time I was talking about how, like, you know, this more optimistic form where it's like, oh, you know, I'm a scientist and I like to, you know, treat that as the most important part of myself. I mean, the deepest, most important part of me is that I'm a human being, maybe even more generally, just a living being or participant in the universe. But even on that video, somebody commented, like, you know, how, like, oh, you need to just stop worrying about gender, and, you know, oh, don't worry about it, basically. And they said they were trying to be helpful, but it reminds me of a broader problem in my life and in STEM in general, where, like, I could tell from that person's comment that, like, they don't understand the extent to which doors will be closed for you regardless of your attitude. And this is not a problem unique to trans people. In fact, I'm less worried about doors being closed to us than I am to people of color and women in general, trans or cis. Our deepest problem, especially in physics, is a lack of African Americans and people of color in general. Or, you know, African Americans, people of sort of various indigenous American, mostly Hispanic heritage, mestizo, various, just generally speaking, it's a bunch of, like, white dudes. And that is a thing about being trans, is you kind of experience, like, having the privilege of a white dude for a significant part of your life, and then losing that privilege, and finally go, oh, now I understand what all those other people were talking about, and sorry to be late to the party, but, yeah, well, what can I say? They were right. And I now kind of want to rephrase what I was trying to say before, where it's like, it's not that science is impartial, and in fact, we have a lot of the same diversity issues as society at large. It's that, and this actually kind of applies, I feel like, to the country I love so much, America, the United States of America, where, like, it's not that things are equal, it's that you feel the actual philosophical and ideological friction when they are unequal. And in a lot of other areas, I feel like, if you work for some sales department, they'll just be like, yeah, there's no diversity. If you want to make a sale, you got to go play golf at the country club with the rich white dudes, so, like, who cares? Whereas in science, it's like, we have diversity problems, and I think we could do a lot more to fix them. But there's at least a sense of, like, yeah, our whole philosophy is that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, although everybody brings their own perspective as well as their own biases, and we welcome that. But ultimately, we're all there to explore and understand nature, and we should have representation from every segment of society, and when we don't, it feels like something is wrong. And I don't necessarily get that from a lot of, the corporate world. But the reality is that a lot of doors are still closed if you're not, just a white dude that's straight, cisgender, often upper middle, or upper class. Some of them are closed via the so-called leaky pipeline, which is actually a imperfect but not too terrible model of the problem. But a lot of them are just closed by outright bias. I mean, nobody says their biases out loud, but if you look at study after study where they send in resumes with the same qualifications but different names, it becomes obvious that there is very much still, like, outright bias in hiring practices as well as admissions practices. And it has not been lost on me that the only time I managed to get a job was when I was able to interview remotely during the pandemic, so nobody ever saw that I was trans. And then I still had to deal with the bias of being a woman in a STEM field, because, I mean, even if you want to be transphobic and say I'm not a woman, well, it says Erica on my resume, and they make their decision of whether or not to give me a callback based on that name, so the bias applies to me regardless of what you think, which I guess is kind of the running theme here. And that's not the only reason I can't get a job, but I've been telling myself that it's only some, like, tiny percentage of the reason, and I'm slowly but surely realizing it's a lot of the reason. It is my own fault that I quit my job at Sandia. I regret that every day. The reason I quit was because of my mental health. The reasons my mental health were so abysmal was because of the pandemic and because of the fact that I was still in this sort of limbo of my transition, combined with the fact that I was moving to a new city, starting a new job in the middle of lockdown with no friends, no social interaction, nothing, and it was pretty brutal. Not to mention it was too soon after my previous breakdown, and I wasn't really ready for full-time work, but I felt the need to do it to, quite frankly, get out of my parents' house. Because my parents are not bad people, but they're very taxing on my mental health to be around because they've never been accepting. And now I've basically forced myself back into the closet because I was convinced that, honestly, in large part because of them, but also because of terrible things in society and media that, that my reason for misery was coming out, and if only I would reject this transgenderism and basically go back in the closet, that, I would be happy again. And that was not true. But now I'm kind of stuck where I can't go forward and I can't go back on transition, because every time I try to go all the way back, the feeling of dysphoria never really goes away. I mean, what can I say? Like, you can't pray the gay or the trans away. It doesn't work. I've been trying. And it's like, when I first came out, like 7 years ago now, my mom, who was supposedly all progressive, 8 years ago, my mom, who was supposedly all progressive, like, straight up asked me, like, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with being into kids, does it? So, like, yeah. My mom asked me if I was a word I'm not going to repeat in response to me coming out. So that should give you a picture of what living with my parents is like. Not that they don't love me at all, but they, for lack of a better word, are just brainwashed by Fox News, and my life is abject misery. Although I actually, in the grand scheme of things, have it good, and I try to be grateful for that. I can't get a job. I live with my parents that basically keep me in the closet again, and I hate myself. So, no, just stop thinking about it is not a solution. Like, I wish it were, but, no.